Ladies and gentlemen, Zimbabwe's political theatre has entered yet another dark episode, and this time the script writers at the Office of Panic and Paranoia seem determined to prove that the old playbook still works. Intimidate the critics, brutalize the activists, and hope the public is too exhausted to resist. But something feels different this time. The regime is pushing harder, faster, and with a level of desperation that betrays just how fragile the 2030 dream has become. And when a government starts panicking before the election cycle even begins, Zimbabweans know the fire behind the smoke is real. It all began with yet another all too familiar storyline. The sudden disappearance of activist Godfrey Karembera Madzibaba Veshanduko in a country where people don't just walk into danger. They are taken by men whose names are unknown but whose uniforms, vehicles and confidence look suspiciously like those of the people who later deny everything. One moment he was a free man walking the streets of Harare, and the next moment he resurfaced in state custody, battered and denied medical care, as if the state wanted him alive, but not too alive. The police immediately rolled out the same dusty script. He is facing charges, maybe under the Patriotic Act, maybe something else vague enough to be adjusted depending on how the public reacts. And the Patriotic Act continues hovering above every citizen like a legal thundercloud that could strike anyone, anywhere, anytime, because a government that's confident in its legitimacy doesn't need laws that criminalize breathing incorrect. But the story didn't end with Karembera. Zimbabwe barely had time to process his ordeal before news broke that two young students, Lyndon Zanga and Malvin Madanda, had been abducted, dumped and warned, all because of a campus election. A whole state apparatus terrified of 21-year-olds choosing a student council leadership. That is how brittle the so-called Second Republic has become. So brittle that even student politics feels like a national security threat. And when the system is shaken by university elections, it means the fear is no longer at the top, it has trickled all the way down. What truly exposes the heartbeat of the regime's paranoia is how these incidents line up with a familiar decades-long pattern: abductions with invisible fingerprints, violence with predictable choreography, threats wrapped in legal jargon, and suspects who always happen to be the critics of one man's political destiny. Human rights defenders see the pattern. Civil society recognizes the script. Even the abductors, if you listen closely, repeat the same lines. Yet somehow, every time, the state insists it knows nothing, proving that the only thing more consistent than Zimbabwean inflation is Zimbabwean denialism. And just when citizens expected the storm to remain calm, the plot suddenly widened. Because if abducting activists at home wasn't enough, the government has now reached across oceans. Transnational repression is no longer a rumor, it is a strategy. A senior police intelligence officer confirmed what Zimbabweans in the diaspora have long suspected. There is a watchlist, not a small one, a long, carefully curated register of names. Tanyaradzwa Emily Daka, Francis Mubani, Xoliso Stole, Moline Muteto, Kreta Mufudze, Dadirai Mukwedeya, Ralph Dube, Elizabeth Chitengo, Happiness Ncube, Edika Mansini, Enes Mapungwana, Nkululeko Ndlovu, Melody Mkwenje, Prince Justin Chiurani, Josephine Mudimu, and others, activists whose only crime is refusing to clap for a failing regime from abroad. Meetings in South Africa, led by Shepherd Yuda, gatherings in the UK organized by Patson Muzua, even a failed demonstration in Zimbabwe, they are all suddenly treated like national security briefings. A war president rattled by activists in Durham, a city whose name many Zimbabweans only learned through this story. Imagine running a country yet losing sleep because someone in the UK held a meeting in a community hall. That level of insecurity is not normal governance. It is paranoia wrapped in power. As all this unfolds, the Patriotic Act becomes the state's favorite weapon. A kind of legal hammer designed to hit any nail the regime decides is injuring national interest. The Act doesn't need clear definitions because ambiguity is the point. The fear it generates is far more useful than the law itself. And while rights groups challenge it in court, the government continues using its shadow to intimidate dissidents, journalists, students, and now Zimbabweans in the diaspora. This is not just harassment. This is a warning shot across the continents. But the cruel genius of authoritarianism is that it escalates quietly. One abduction becomes two. Two become a pattern. The pattern becomes normalized. And once citizens expect violence, the state no longer needs to hide it. This is why the sudden speed, brutality, and global reach of these new cases reveal something the regime will never admit. It is losing control of the narrative. It cannot silence everyone at home, so it stretches its hands abroad. It cannot convince young people, so it terrifies them. It cannot win popularity, so it manufactures patriotism. It cannot stop diaspora mobilization, so it criminalizes it. And it cannot stop 2028 from coming, so it pushes 2030 like a drowning man clinging to a floating log. This is why the country feels tense. Zimbabweans have seen this movie too many times and they know how the next act usually plays out. But something has shifted. Citizens are more alert, the diaspora is more organized, human rights activists are more connected, and each new abduction exposes more of the regime's fear than its strength. Every victim becomes a witness. Every disappearance becomes a headline. Every torture would become a political scar the world can see. And so, the final question now hangs in the air like a cliffhanger. How far is Mnangagwa willing to go to silence dissent? Especially now that the activists are multiplying, the diaspora is awake, and the world is watching. Because when a regime begins hunting critics beyond its borders, it isn't showing power, it's revealing panic. It's confessing that the battle for legitimacy is already lost at home. Zimbabwe is entering a dangerous chapter, but also a revealing one, because a government that must abduct its own people in the shadows is a government afraid of them in daylight. And that fear, more than the Patriotic Act, more than the watchlists, more than the threats, is the clearest sign that resistance is working. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Zimwaves TV. Subscribe, share, and comment below. We want to hear your opinions.